And now, the rest of the story. Patrick Morrissey was a bad man. Maybe from the very beginning, but there was something about growing up on the American frontier in the 1850s that helps you stay bad and sometimes get worse. Early in his misspent life, much of Patrick Morrissey's days and even more of his nights were frittered away in one or another of the town's saloons, fighting, drinking, playing cards, carousing with shady ladies. Back then and there, you could disappear in a crowd doing the same because, quite frankly, there were just more bad guys than good guys. At least, so it seemed. And the overcrowded jail simply could not accommodate the considerable numbers who deserved to be there. Today's movies occasionally romanticize the likes of thereabouts, but what it was brutal and vile by any measure. And it also poisoned the soil in which Pat Morrissey sprouted and grew. As one of the town's less ambitious criminals, he was forced to subsidize his drinking and gambling and whoring in a particularly repugnant way. He stole from his own mother. Mrs. Morrisy was a patient, kind woman, trapped inextricably by her circumstances, a good person struggling to survive in a bad place in bad times. One bleak night in 1872, her son Patrick pounded on her door demanding more money, and when she refused to open the door, he broke it down. Once inside, Patrick repeated his demand. Mrs. Morrisy said no, not a penny more, for the sordid uses that he would surely put it to. So Patrick struck his mother hard, knocked her to the floor, and it was not the first time. But this time, for some reason nobody knows, Mrs. Morrisy gazed up and said, "You'd better kill your mother and be done with it." And perhaps for the first time in Patrick Morrisy's life, he obeyed his mother. He took the knife with which she had been cutting bread and plunged it into her heart. The town was one big den of thieves and murderers, despite which nobody had been hanged for more than 6 years. No question in Morrisy's mind that he was going to get away with matricide, but he hadn't figured on one thing: the new sheriff, who, unknown to anybody then, would come to be feared as the hanging sheriff, the man who cleaned up the dirtiest town in the Wild East. The Wild East? That's right. While the American West was fast becoming populated by gentlemen bandits and righteous lawmen from the chivalrous American South, the eastern United States was blotted by a cesspool on the frontier of civilization itself. A dark little hole in Erie County, New York, boasted 673 saloons and even more gambling houses and brothels and sex shows, the so-called sink of iniquity called Buffalo. But the end of that urban nightmare and the beginnings of the beautiful Buffalo we see today was the hanging sheriff who cleaned up the town, the executioner who authored a fitting end to the bad ballad of Patrick Morrissey, the lawman who personally jerked the noose tight around Morrisy's throat and sprung the trap door from under his feet in 1872, the good guy who showed us how the East was won and went on to become President of the United States, Stephen Grover Cleveland. Now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. You know, when we talk about presidents these days, Grover Cleveland's name's just not one that comes up that often. Until Mr. Harvey's broadcast, most of us probably had never heard of Patrick Morrissey, myself included. But I learned that Patrick Morrissey was born in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1844. In reverence of the patron saint of Ireland and his being born on the traditional death date of St. Patrick, his parents named him, well, Patrick. The Morrissey family crossed the ocean and settled in Buffalo, New York. His father died shortly after their arrival. To earn money, Patrick's mother kept boarders and ran a saloon in her home in a poor area known as the Infected District. That's an unfortunate nickname, isn't it? Patrick had little education and, this was a quote, was a wild boy. He occasionally got into legal trouble. In 1865, he was convicted on charges of burglary and larceny and sentenced to 3.5 years in the Auburn prison. Patrick's mother begged Governor Fenton to pardon Patrick, and after only 7 or 8 months in prison, Governor Fenton conceded and pardoned Patrick. Patrick's mother was 55-year-old Ann Morrisy. Newspapers described Ann as being associated with low people, which matched her character. Ann had a terrible temper, and newspapers reported that she often abused her children. That's Patrick and his 3 younger sisters. Patrick worked as a sailor, mostly because the job took him away from police in Buffalo. He took his most recent job at sea to escape an arrest. He sailed to South Africa, Buenos Aires, to Liverpool, and back to New York. The trip took about a year. Then he returned to his mother's boarding house on June 16, 1872. He spent the majority of his time in a drunken condition. During his binges, he often requested the little money his mother had saved and claimed that he had a right to it because he was the oldest child. On June 22, 1872, that was a Saturday night, Patrick went on a bender. About noon the next day, Patrick went to his mother's house, got something to eat, then left again. 2 hours later, Patrick, still drunk, returned to his mother's house. Boarders said he had a wild look about him. At the time, Ann was in the dining room, which was behind the barroom, carving the meat in preparation for dinner. The carving knife was described as having a blade nearly 7 inches long, with a very sharp point. This is a 7-inch blade knife here. Angeline Springston, who worked at the boarding house as a cook, was in an adjoining room. Several men, including Robert Blackledge and his stepson, John O'Brien, were in the barroom. Patrick walked through the barroom and into the dining room where he began arguing with his mother. Those in the house heard Ann yell for Patrick to leave the place. She yelled that she had had enough trouble with him and that if he did not leave and stop mistreating her, she would send for the police and have him arrested. Patrick became enraged. While his mother's back was turned, Patrick snatched the carving knife from her with his right hand. He grabbed his mother's right shoulder with his left hand and spun her around, and he plunged all 7 inches of the carving knife blade into her left breast. The handle of the knife stopped it from going any further. Patrick retracted the knife from her body, threw it on the table. The cook and the men in the barroom heard Ann utter a sharp cry of, "Oh!" Upon hearing the cry, Robert Blackledge ran toward the dining room, but he was met at the doorway by Ann, who was staggering toward him. The knife's blade had punctured her left lung, and blood streamed from her mouth. She collapsed into Robert's arms, and he laid her down on the barroom floor. Now, Robert was unaware that Ann had been stabbed. He saw the blood streaming from her mouth and thought Patrick had punched her in the face. Robert told his stepson, John, to go get a doctor and alert the police. When Patrick saw his mother lying on the floor, he said, "I did it! I've killed her!" The men carried Ann upstairs and placed her on a bed. They realized she had been stabbed when Angeline, the cook, opened Ann's shirt. Within 5 minutes of the stabbing, Ann died without uttering another word. Patrick made no attempt to escape. He sat on a bed in the dining room and waited for the police to arrive. Policemen arrested Patrick and took him to the police station for questioning. Patrick, either still drunk or pretending to be drunk, continually contradicted his own statements. He denied that he had any part in the stabbing, then confessed to the crime, then denied it again. He was anxious to know who would inherit his mother's property and argued that since he was the oldest, it should be his. At Patrick's trial, his defense attorneys did not deny that Patrick had killed the woman, but claimed he was temporarily insane, this is a quote, caused by liquor and a disposition to lightheadedness resulting from a blow received on his head. The jury retired after closing arguments and, after a brief absence, returned with a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. 4 days later, the judge sentenced Patrick to be hanged by the neck until dead. Patrick's attorney pleaded with the governor for a reprieve, but he would not interfere with the jury's verdict. Patrick's attorney argued that the trial had followed the murder too rapidly. The murder occurred on June the 23rd, and the trial began just 2 days later. They also argued that the trial was too short. It took only 21 days from the beginning of Patrick's trial until the judge sentenced him to death. The attorneys filed a motion for a new trial before the Supreme Court, but the motion was denied. The legal process in 1872 was swift. Now, Grover Cleveland was an attorney until he was elected sheriff of Erie County. He took office in 1871. On September 6, 1872, Grover Cleveland led the condemned man from his jail cell to a holding room. A crowd gathered in the yard of the courthouse in anticipation of a public hanging. Members of the crowd requested to be allowed to watch the hanging, but the sheriff refused. A hush fell over the crowd when the undertaker delivered a black walnut casket to the courthouse. The sheriff and 3 of his deputies dressed Patrick in a black robe and placed the noose around his neck. The sheriff ordered 25 of his deputies to clear the courthouse yard of everyone except 12 witnesses who had passes to watch the hanging, the number required by law. The future president led Patrick into the yard of the courthouse and to the scaffolding, which was shielded from the public view by temporary canvas walls. 2 deputies led Patrick up the steps to the hanging platform. Grover Cleveland positioned himself on the ground next to the handle which would release the trap door. Once the deputies read the death warrant aloud, attached the noose to the hook on the hanging platform, and pulled a black hood over Patrick's face. One of Grover Cleveland's duties as sheriff was to carry out death sentences. Rather than delegating that task to someone else, Grover felt that it was his responsibility, his burden to carry as sheriff. The future president pulled the lever, and the condemned man fell to his death. In January 1882, 10 years after the execution, Grover Cleveland was elected mayor of Buffalo. A year later, he became governor of New York. He began his first term as president in 1885 and his second term as president in 1893. He remains the only president to personally execute someone convicted of a crime, not once, but twice. In 1873, just 5 months after Patrick's execution, Grover Cleveland pulled the lever and executed another convicted murderer, John Gaffney. Grover Cleveland's future political opponents nicknamed him the Buffalo Hangman. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.